Hello! Today I'm taking a look at Final Fantasy IV, Squaresoft's 1991 release for the Super Nintendo, which marked a significant step forward in the development of the Final Fantasy series and the wider JRPG genre. Now, as with several other Final Fantasy games, Final Fantasy IV has found itself revisited and remade in recent years, with releases across Nintendo DS, PSP, PC, and several others. And for my part, I recently played back through the game for the first time in a long time, and I really enjoyed the quite simple yet appealing 3D format of the remake version. And I think, looking broadly at Square's remake endeavours, it's one of the more considered and well executed of the remakes, and it serves as a good entry point to Final Fantasy for newcomers who might have been deterred by the more traditional, pixel-based versions. And I think this is worth noting on because it's a common misconception that the Final Fantasy games only really began or warranted attention from about Final Fantasy VI or Final Fantasy VII onwards, with regards to quality, and in particular narrative quality. But I think Final Fantasy IV is an incredibly worthwhile entry to the series, arguably and an incredibly overlooked entry to the series, and certainly one that is done justice by the remake version, the DS version, which is available on Steam and a few other consoles. And it benefits hugely from this overhaul and being ushered onto modern platforms, to be experienced by a new generation of gamer. So, as with other Final Fantasy games that are featured on the channel, this discussion will touch on core aspects of the game experience, including story, characters and gameplay, while at the same time looking at the distinguishing features of Final Fantasy IV and how it contributes to the wider canon and the enduring legacy of the Final Fantasy series. Kicking off and looking at the context of the time, the shift into the 1990s saw Final Fantasy, along with other pioneering JRPGs such as Dragon Quest and Phantasy Star over on Sega, begin to inch out of their experimental origins and begin to take shape as games with a specific set of conventions and expectations. And in the case of Final Fantasy IV, it was in many ways a blueprint for future Final Fantasies, and elements such as the ATB battle system is an often noted precedent that was set by this game in retrospective discussions. But what Final Fantasy IV also did was begin to branch more thoroughly away from the D&D inspired tabletop origins of the RPG format, wherein character classes and characteristics were more player determined. And instead it shifted focus onto storytelling and telling established character stories, rather than offering a generic set of heroes with very little to no personality or backstory. So on this note, it's prudent to note that back in Final Fantasy II, Square did experiment with more conventional methods of storytelling, and rather than generic light warriors or onion knights, we took control of Firion and his friends to battle an evil empire, and the grinding RPG gameplay of Final Fantasy II was balanced around this cohesive but somewhat sparse storyline. So it was really Final Fantasy IV where we began seeing a massive shift towards a more considered and complex narrative, which owes partly to the advances in technology, I think, but also due to Hironobu Sakaguchi's growing maturity as a writer. And he has stated in previous interviews that this is down to his experiences working alongside veterans in the manga industry. So as such, FF4 proved a much more narrative-driven title, with a renewed focus on developing not only the hero's story arc, but also that of the individuals, the sub-characters who join our hero on his quest and comprise a sort of fellowship, if you like. So what we have in Final Fantasy IV is a furtive step towards the sprawling, intertwining character arcs that have since come to define the series. And rather than attention being focused purely on the broad arc of the heroes, the heroes defeating the villains, and that's it, we observe the plights of each fellowship character, their origins, their pursuits, and their progression over the course of the story. It departs from common gaming conventions of the time, and rather than Cecil as protagonist being the centre of attention, supporting casts such as Tellah, Edward, Radia, and Cid contribute equally to the story. And while Cecil is certainly the linchpin between these characters, and most often the intended player character, the weighting of the scenarios between this sizable cast make Final Fantasy IV a very obviously ensemble and narratively balanced game. Now, relating back to the introduction of fixed character classes in the gameplay mechanics, this wasn't an arbitrary limitation placed on the battle system, but rather it helped deliver on these aforementioned character stories, and by defining their classes, it helped establish both their role and status in the game world, but also their character development and their progression as the story wears on. For example, our hero Cecil starts out as a Dark Knight, a rather dubious title that establishes his characteristics and allegiances early on. A pivotal part of the game story is his transition into the Paladin class, which impacts both his design and gameplay, but is also crucial to his character development, within the wider story, and is something I don't think it could have been achievable, or at least not with the same impact, if the game had stuck with the more impersonal and player-determinate job class systems. In similar fashion, we have Rydia, who doesn't so much change job class as grow up and evolve into her designated summoner class, and Tellah, who's likewise defined in both story and battle by his veteran mage status and as a wielder of black magic, which does in fact prove his undoing and is essential to his story and progression, which I'll touch on shortly. But ultimately, the story of Final Fantasy IV was augmented by the introduction of fixed job classes, giving weight and personality to each playable character. And while some fans and players see fixed job classes as a limitation and prefer the more ambiguous or malleable systems, such as in Final Fantasy VII, for example, and I can appreciate that argument. Personally, I do like the pseudo-class system of Final Fantasy X, where you can sort of overlap and override the job class territories. I think using job classes as a personality-defining story element succeeded very well in Final Fantasy IV, and was a great step towards unifying the disparate aspects of gameplay, where now we have story reflecting battle skill sets and vice versa. So I think that was a great unifying and harmonizing element of this particular Final Fantasy. So that's a look at the ensemble composition of the story, and I'll touch more on the characters momentarily. But taking a step back and looking at the setting of Final Fantasy IV, we find ourselves in a world partitioned up by various kingdoms and provincial towns in the now familiar Final Fantasy style, with progressive modes of transport that allow us to access more and more of the overworld as the story unfolds, and in this case, of course, underworld as well. We also have the familiar Final Fantasy use of crystals, and specifically crystals that are integral to planetary balance and power in the game. And much like other Final Fantasies, they are integral to the composition of the world and the central story as it unfolds. The encroachment of sci-fi elements on the otherwise high fantasy setting is also maintained and somewhat increased in Final Fantasy IV from the previous games. And what we have here is the merging of castles and knights and archaic feudal kingdoms with mechanized airships, giant robots and aliens on the moon, which some have termed science fantasy, which I think is quite a fitting phrase for these particular titles. And indeed, touching on Final Fantasy IV's story, the narrative twist is, in fact, the existence of extraterrestrial life forms, which live on the moon, of which Cecil is revealed to be one, and Golbez is revealed to be another. And, the visit to the moon and space travel in general became a recurring motif of Final Fantasy games. And in many ways, it embodies this shift, from Final Fantasy IV. It embodies this shift into the sci-fi, that was kind of fully realised in Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII. And, of course, the moon is also used as a throwback in Final Fantasy IX with Zidane and Kuja's story, which, thinking about it, actually overlaps quite strongly with Final Fantasy IV and Cecil's story and Golbez and that relationship there. So What's interesting about the setting and the narrative framework of Final Fantasy IV is that despite diluting its high fantasy origins with this sci-fi stuff, it still retained a lot of the Tolkien-esque and fairy tale elements that would, go on to get lost or diluted in later games. For example, where Final Fantasy V and VI sees our protagonists as thieves and wanderers and adventurers, and Final Fantasy VII and VIII see our protagonists as mercenaries, most of our party in Final Fantasy IV comprises of royalty, princes, princesses, and the upper echelons of society. Indeed, even the ending sees Cecil marry Rosa to take the throne of Baron. So there's a very elitist composition of characters here that echoes earlier fantasy literature. And just looking at Tolkien's Fellowship of the Ring as a comparison, we have Legolas and Gimli and Boromir, who are all princes of their respective kingdoms. And of course Aragorn, who finally ascends the throne in Return of the King. And in similar fashion we have old fairy tales and folk tales such as Beauty and the Beast or Sleeping Beauty, which usually have a prince as the romantic counterpart or the central protagonist. Such is the traditions of fantasy storytelling. So it's interesting that Final Fantasy IV was the last game to really compose its central party of reputed authority figures rather than motley vagabonds. And those of you that might have watched my Final Fantasy Tactics video, that game was very interesting about how it turned that concept on its head and actually looked at authority and royalty as actually quite a villainous thing. And, it was very based on, the class system, that game. But Final Fantasy IV, it presented a world where kingdoms and empires needed rescuing rather than rebelling against or, overthrowing, such as we've seen in several other Final Fantasy titles that often comprise of an evil empire or something along those lines. Now, just noting back on the sci-fi aspects of Final Fantasy IV and how that was dialed up in this game to a sort of unprecedented degree until we got to about Final Fantasy VI or VII, it was interesting to see how fans responded to this, and some of the more out there stuff, such as the extraterrestrial bad guy who is revealed to be Zemus, as opposed to Golbez, who is something of a red herring. And as I've previously noted, rather than any evil empire or earthly kingdom that turns out to be the antagonist, we actually have these creatures on the moon, and Zemus in particular, who are the kind of cause of all the wrong in the world. And as I say, I've seen discussions and reviews in the past that criticise this narrative shift from about the point we acquire the final airship. Things go into this bizarre realm of space travel and, just crazy stuff. And on the one hand, I do get it, and, up to that point, Final Fantasy IV, the story had been playing out in a generally traditional high fantasy way for the most part. But on the other hand, and I suppose I say this with the benefit of hindsight and having played other Final Fantasy games first, this kooky reveal and wild tangent into space and the unexpected are kind of what we've come to expect of the series, and it's part of what makes Final Fantasy quite unique in its own thing, this science fantasy as it's been called. And for me personally, it wasn't the worst curveball that this series has ever delivered in terms of a narrative twist. And actually, Cecil's relationship to Golbez in particular, I think was really well done, and I really quite liked that narrative turn. So, since we're noting Cecil and Golbez, let's touch on the themes of Final Fantasy IV. And this was the first game in the series that I think really started developing thematic arcs, to the central stories. Such was the ability of Square to now write more complex stories for their games. And in interviews, the development team has stated that darkness and lightness were key themes that they drew upon for the central story, along with sub-themes of friendship and camaraderie and that sort of thing. So this might sound like standard fare for a Final Fantasy these days, since most of them rely on friendship and members of our party helping the hero through some personal crisis. But it's prudent to note that Final Fantasy IV was the first to really deliver on this theme in a meaningful way, through its ensemble cast. For example, helping a grieving Prince Edward overcome the death of Anna and attain some sort of personal strength is an early scenario that delivers on this quite well. And so is trying to temper Tellah's lust for revenge, over the death of his daughter, and Palom and Parom's selfless acts of petrification, for example, in order to save their friends. All of these small scenarios and little threads of the story contribute to a respective whole and help develop these character arcs under the unifying theme of friendship. Indeed, a pivotal scene that could be considered as the apex of this is when the surviving ensemble characters unite once more to battle the giant of Babel, which, in the remake of Final Fantasy IV, at least, is really delivered with some optimism and these great cinematic flourishes that's quite heartwarming and once again, delivers strongly on this idea of friendship. Regarding the darkness to lightness, as Square have stated, this is most evident through Cecil's journey in particular, and for the first time we have a protagonist who has consequential internal issues to contend with alongside the macro arc of defeating the villains and salvaging the crystals. His transition from a Dark Knight to a Paladin is essential to this, and the visual metaphoring in his appearance is a very literal delivery of the theme. But aside from the obvious aesthetic changes and gameplay changes, Cecil is also shown to be quite an insecure and self-critical character at the beginning of the game. He struggles with his identity and his blind loyalty to the manipulated King of Baron, and as such he is swiftly removed from his rank and his captaincy of the Red Wings. And it's only later, through a combination of his newly acquired friendships, and I think pivotally through his companionship with Rydia after the death of her mother, that Cecil self-actualizes. He goes through a process of change that sees him confront his past self, in a literal sense, battling a manifestation of the Dark Knight. And he finally becomes a paladin. And personally, I thought this was a great arc, and it was the first time we really saw a protagonist harbouring doubts about themselves. And in many ways, although Cloud Strife is highly regarded for his identity crisis and his fantastic character arc in Final Fantasy VII, I think there's a strong argument that rather than being a wholly innovative character story, Cecil is in many ways a blueprint for what we saw with Cloud Strife and the more introspective protagonists that we saw in later Final Fantasy games. Now, off the back of Cecil, it's worth touching on two key counterparts to him in the story, the first of which is Golbez, and the second of which is Kain. Looking at Golbez first, it could be argued that the whole light versus dark angle is embodied by his role as an antagonist and Cecil's role as a protagonist. And this is particularly noteworthy once we discover that they are brothers towards the end of the game. The flashback scenarios that were introduced show the child Theodore slowly being consumed by darkness after unfortunate events kill his parents. And as Zemus manipulates him to blame his baby sibling, and of course the wider world, he disappears off to collect the crystals and later re-emerge as Golbez. I personally felt that this was a really neat backstory to build up an antagonist, and it has echoes of the Anakin Skywalker tragedy and his transition into Darth Vader that we see in the Star Wars universe. And as is common with Final Fantasy games, it bridges the protagonist and the antagonist with something a little more personal than merely good versus evil. And digressing slightly, as I've noted before, we often have connections between certain heroes and certain villains in the Final Fantasy games. This shadow self, as it's often called, whether it's Cloud and Sephiroth, Tidus and Jecht, Zidane and Kuja. And it usually works really well to bring these respective character arcs to fruition and resolve the root of the personal crisis that the hero has suffered all along. That mysterious part of their past that has propelled them forwards, in this adventure. Now, of course, this device was arguably first introduced with Leon in Final Fantasy II, But owing to the more considered storytelling in Final Fantasy IV, Golbez was characterised and delivered a little bit better. He was a mysterious and very vindictive antagonist that was revealed sparingly throughout the story, which I think is a great way to build up a sense of intrigue and foreboding. And then, of course, we have the curveball delivery of his brotherhood with Cecil, and the fact, of course, that they're both Lunarians as well. And what I liked most, and it offered him a good conclusion, was the fact that they didn't kill him off. He wasn't given an arbitrary death as a villain, but actually he was given an open-ended conclusion that left him open to redemption, which I found quite rewarding, narratively speaking, and I think echoes shades of Darth Vader's closure in Star Wars. In his final moments, we have a sense of light overcoming darkness. And on that note, I've just recalled there's a really interesting monologue delivered towards the end of the game about how there will always be light, but light always casts shadows. And I think that touches brilliantly on the symbiotic nature of good and bad, light and dark, and Cecil and Golbez, and this ability for neither light or dark to truly prevail over one or the other. So, despite the infancy of the gaming industry and the JRPG industry at this time, I think that was, quite strong themes that they delivered on here, and it was a really nice conclusion to Final Fantasy IV. So, I'm going to move on to Kain Highwind now, and I think much like Golbez, he's something of a counterpart to Cecil and the worldview that he develops. And at the beginning of the game, we see Kain as a comrade in arms, with Cecil, until they very quickly find themselves on opposing sides. And while Cecil fights the good fight and goes on a journey of self-discovery, Kain becomes an underling of the Antagonists in a similar fashion to Squall and Cypher, and several Final Fantasy characters, that would follow. And there's an interesting angle to Kain insofar as he's personally torn between his friend Cecil and his secret love for Cecil's intended, which is Rosa, along with his allegiances, to the kingdom, which ally him against Cecil at certain points of the game. And for my part, this had the foundations of a really interesting character arc regarding Kain, and he was something of a conflicted grey character that I've always admired when it's done well. And I think it was great, but ultimately it was undermined by the mind control storyline that stems from Golbez, and by extension the true antagonist behind him, which was Zemus. Now, I'm not saying it was the worst storyline in the world, and to give Sakaguchi and his team all due credit, Final Fantasy IV's storyline was unprecedented in its maturity for the time. But if I'm being pedantic, I think Kain's self-conflict around his affections for Rosa and his allegiance to the kingdom could have been enough on its own to propel his story and his antagonism towards Cecil forwards. And by having him under the influence of mind control, it essentially robs some of that potential development and dramatic soul-searching, because when he snaps out of it, of course he feels guilty, but arguably he's not really undergone a legitimate change as a character. He hasn't undergone an emotive arc, because it's much more like I woke up and it was all a dream. Kind of an artificial, character story, if you like. But to counter that argument, being under the control of the antagonists does draw him into the central story and emphasise their power a little bit more. And there is, of course, the case that those who have opened themselves up to darkness are the ones that are more susceptible to mind control in the first place. So that legitimizes his disposition quite well and shows how he's less mentally or morally robust than his comrade Cecil. So moving on, I think the next most significant character orbiting Cecil and the central story is arguably Rosa. And in many respects, her childhood friendship with both Cecil and Kain forms a sort of relational triumvirate that propels the more personal, emotive subplot forwards, running in tandem with the larger narrative. She's also a great example of Square's historic ability to produce a strong female lead. And while, yes, she does get kidnapped and the party must go and rescue her, which plays into this somewhat stereotypical formula, Her personal arc actually sees her develop her own formidable nature and a willingness to step into harm's way to assist her friends on their adventure, which comes to fruition in the end game when she refuses to leave, prior to the final battle. Another interesting precedent set by Rosa was her role as a white mage, and along with Rydia having the role of a summoner, this was the start of a Final Fantasy trend that persists to the present day, which is the correlation between female leads and healing or summoning job classes. And it's interesting to consider this and the design decisions that went into making this permanent job class for Rosa and the female protagonist to follow. Because on the one hand, it seems convenient for the sword-wielding male protagonist, who is usually defined by physical strength, to be counterbalanced by something more mystical and non-corporeal and spiritual, which gives a complementary yin and yang to the male and female leads. And at the same time, it plays to traditional ideas of the female as a maternal figure, creators, carers, healers, which the white mage and the summoning attributes, kind of represent in a way. But on the other hand, looking at Final Fantasy as a series that has drawn upon fairy tales and folklore dating back through history all the way to the Greeks, we have the oracles at Delphi, as magic wielders and seers and mystical beings. Witches, for example, they're almost always female, in fairy tales and folklore and mythology. So this lends to their representation in the Final Fantasy games from 4 onwards as magic wielders and in touch with more intangible aspects of the world. So that was an observation I made with Rosa, which I found quite interesting. Now, turning to the remaining cast, this is the first Final Fantasy that really introduced the motley of unlikely characters that comprise our party, each from differing regions and coming into the story with different pursuits and agendas. But unlike later titles, such as Final Fantasy 6, 7 or 8, where the characters were a process of acquisition, and then from that point you could pretty much pick and choose your party from your favourite heroes, Final Fantasy IV handled party formation and character acquisition in a much more fluid, story-driven way, with almost every scenario featuring a specific set of characters in service of a particular narrative development, or plot point. Now, it's likely that the staggered inclusion of the party members and their pacing in the story roots back to the permanent job class system that Square had introduced in this title, and how they needed to sort of balance progression within the gameplay, perhaps. I haven't personally read anything to this effect, but whether they based the story around the character classes or whether they hinged the character classes around the story is an interesting question, and you might assume that they would develop the mechanics of the game before going into the intricacies of the story, but who knows, it may have been done adjacently. But regardless, what we have in Final Fantasy IV is ultimately a well-realised set of characters, which, thanks to the story pacing and the focus on a few characters at a time, really allowed each of them to shine through and develop well to a greater or lesser degree. But naturally, the earlier a character is introduced, the more time they have to contribute and make an impact on the story and the player. And for example, Tellah arguably added much more weight to the story than Edge, who was introduced much later. So, on the note of Tellah and Final Fantasy IV's story in general, it was surprising in that it didn't shy away from elements of tragedy and loss. And during the story, we see various selfless acts, from Yang diving into an explosion to save his friends, Cid diving into the underworld, and Palom and Parom turning into stone to save the party from a trap. Each of these sacrifices, if we like, kind of service the story and delivers on this theme of friendship and prove to be quite emotional scenarios for the player to witness. However, it's also been argued by several fans that these apparent sacrifices are cheapened by the fact that they are not final, and although it's excellent to see the party regrouping in an optimistic montage to confront the Giant of Babel, the fact that these characters who are assumed dead sort of suddenly reappear in an act of Deus Ex Machina some felt it undermined the tragedy of their demise, and once again, it may have been an excuse to keep their job classes out of the game for a period of time. But turning to Tellah, on the other hand, this is one of the few characters in the game to actually suffer a permanent death, and it's quite a tragic moment in the story that I think is doubly so because of the nature of his demise. Tellah is a haunted character who is never able to accept the death of his daughter or relent in his pursuit of revenge. And as such, it's an irony that rather than being killed by an antagonist, it is actually summoning his own spell to deliver on his revenge that ultimately kills him. And I found it quite a profound moment in the game that he died without peace or fulfillment, and it all fitted perfectly with his characterization as a stubborn old man, who, unlike the rest of the party, was unable to alter or develop their worldview as they progressed on this adventure. So, based on this, I think Tellah was a great character, and he was fun to have around regardless. But regarding the other non-deaths, such as they were, that occurred with the remaining cast, I can understand the frustration with that, and much like the whole mind control thing, it's an elementary story device that, if done with one character, is sort of forgivable and can actually contribute to a story, such as Golbez being controlled, that was acceptable. But if you're using it with 2, 3, 4 characters, it becomes a bit contrived, and the emotive impact of their return is somewhat diluted. It's the law of diminishing returns, if you like. But that said, I think the detriments of Final Fantasy IV are far outweighed by its qualities, and more than simply being the first proper Final Fantasy game, as some call it, I think it endures on its own merits, and is a great example of the big ensemble fantasies that gave us involved story and intriguing characters to sort of adventure through the game with. Now, there's some other aspects of the game story I haven't touched on much that I think contribute well to the overall piece, and were again elements that we saw shine through in later installments of the series. The concept of light and dark, particularly using the light and dark crystals, it not only plays to the themes that I've discussed previously, but they also initiated the pilgrimage quest, the acquisition quest, which became popular with several later Final Fantasies, such as Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy XV, and to a lesser extent Final Fantasy VII, where we quested around for the huge materia. And additionally, the light and dark crystals, along with the important secondary bosses, which was the 4 elemental archfiends, also plays to this enduring trope within Final Fantasy games, which is nature, equilibrium and elemental balance. And each game, to a greater or lesser degree, incorporates ideas of the elements and how the world harmonizes itself. And as I've discussed elsewhere, it resides in this sort of traditional Japanese belief system, such as Shintoism and Buddhism, that contribute strongly to Japanese culture, and I think shine through in several Final Fantasies. For example, the life stream in 7 or the far plane in 10, various examples that I've discussed in the past. Additionally, I mentioned space travel earlier, but also of note is the party's visit to the underworld. And it's a relatively fleeting scenario in Final Fantasy IV, but it's a great example of how Final Fantasy weaves East and West narrative traditions and fantasy and sci-fi narrative traditions together really well. And the concept of an underworld is generally something that resides in Western tradition, and whether it's Dante's Inferno, which is of course a Christian view of it, or the tragedy of Orpheus and Eurydice, which is an ancient Greek view of the underworld. Western history is rich in tales where humans have to venture into the depths of the underworld to salvage or explore, or something. So I really liked it in Final Fantasy IV, and I think it's evidence of how Sakaguchi and his team managed to make Final Fantasy something uniquely its own, by wantonly blending all these different story traditions and facets of history together. So on a final note before wrapping up, I'd like to touch on Zemus, who is the main antagonist operating behind the curtain, and also the music score by Nobuo Uematsu, which arguably reached new heights in this game, and set his course over the next decade to become one of the leading composers in video games. So regarding Zemus, I've read that some found him quite an unexpected reveal in the endgame and felt that it undermined Golbez and his build-up as a central villain. But for my part, I think it was an interesting device precisely because it allowed Golbez to have this third dimension, if you like, and this conflicted sensibility about himself. But it is interesting that, looking broadly at Final Fantasy, how the more popular villains are the more self-determinate ones. So, for example, Sephiroth and Ardyn in particular, huge fan favourites. And these two are kind of the architects of disaster and dilemma in their respective games. There's nobody behind them pulling their strings. They're wholly self-determinate villains. And by comparison, some of the true antagonists in later Final Fantasies, these entities behind the curtain pulling the strings, have fallen a bit flat. And, because they're arbitrarily nihilistic in their villainy, fans haven't responded to them as strongly. Yu Yevon, as an example, and Necron, as another, have had, severe amounts of criticism levelled at them. And I suppose it boils down to these Final Fantasy villains wanting to destroy the world, but the self-determinate ones who feature throughout the story, such as Ardyn and Sephiroth, they are developed in such a way that we at least understand why they want to destroy the world. And we could go so far as to say that we develop empathy for them as an audience to a certain degree. While Zemus and Necron and Yu Yevon, they are used much more to influence and craft a certain sad tragedy around the characters that they've led astray. For example, Golbez, Kuja and Jecht in the respective examples. So for my part, I can understand the criticisms that are levelled at these sort of ambiguous, nihilistic end bosses, but ultimately, for the most part, they service the story by helping to develop the prominent secondary villains, that we've contended with throughout the adventure. And I think Golbez, Kuja and Jecht, all three of them, despite not being the root of all evil, are actually incredibly interesting and quite deep, redemptive characters, in their stories. So, wrapping up on the music now, as I've stated, I think this is where Final Fantasy really started setting the bar, for the quality of the score within the RPG genre and within video games in general. And almost every track, whether it's the Kingdom of Baron theme through to the battle theme, delivered really well on establishing context, and tone for the story and the locations. And the great task of the game composer, in the pre-cinematic era of gaming, was to craft soundtracks that could repeat and repeat and repeat for the duration of a dungeon or a town and not get tiresome for the audience. And I think that Final Fantasy IV was the first to really succeed in doing that almost flawlessly. And much like the job class system, we also had several character-specific themes introduced that, particularly in the pre-voice acted age of gaming, really helped establish personality and develop ideas about who our characters are, when there was no voice acting or facial expressions to sort of assist with this. And as such, ideas about Golbez or Cecil or Rosa were crafted around Uematsu's excellent score and really helped deliver on atmosphere and story, despite this game being confined to the 16-bit SNES, in its original debut. So there we have it. That concludes my initial look at Final Fantasy IV. If you got this far, kudos to you, and thanks for listening. And if you enjoyed the episode, please consider sharing on your social channels and also subscribing, which will help you keep updated with my latest posts.